wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
A very good evening to all our viewers on Globespan 24/7 as we come to you on this Wednesday night program. Today was, for those of you in New York, you have had the real taste of an early summer. It was very, very hot, I'm told. I was in the office most of the time, so I didn't come outside. But some of my clients who came in said it was so hot outside. So I hope you enjoyed the good weather as we prepare for spring and summer. Hope you guys in Guyana had a wonderful Easter. You know, I've seen some pictures of the celebration at the national park, on the seawalls, on the West Demerara, on the Berbice. And I can see everyone had, well, those who were out had a really great time, and I'm glad everything went well. We want to thank Nohar Singh for making this platform available, and of course, to Devin Bissou, our technical specialist. Tonight, we are discussing a very, very important matter that affects the future of Guyana, and that is our border with Venezuela. Now, for those of us who've been following the events, the World Court made a ruling this week, and that is why we have one of the best positioned person in Guyana. As we know, he was a former finance minister under the Hoyt administration. He was a Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Greenidge administration, and under the Ali administration, he had been retained to be the border czar. And tonight, it's a great pleasure for us to invite again to the program Ambassador Carl Greenidge. Ambassador, welcome.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Okay. And of course, my co-host is Dr. Rose. Dr. Rose, welcome.
Thank you, Charles, and welcome to the program, everyone.
All right, Ambassador, we have all read the details, and as we know, in either boxing or even a cricket match, you know, sometimes we go out there and we bat so well, and then the next time we go in another match and we are bowled the first ball. So it has been great news for Guyana. So can you tell our viewers exactly what has happened, or what that ruling in the International Court meant for Guyana and the matter with Venezuela?
Well, thank you very much for asking, and also for the caution that one has to bear in mind that we are involved in a process, and in that process, the decision that the court has just handed down is not the final decision as regards what we call the merits. So just, if I might quickly recap for you, we had affairs even before the court, before we went before the court, and this was what was called enhanced mediation. The UN Secretary General, in accordance with the Geneva Agreement and in agreement with the Venezuelan government, took us through an exercise trying to negotiate and see whether we could narrow the distance between the two governments. And it turned out that that was not possible. And so the SG, in keeping with Article 4 of the Geneva Agreement, and having taken into account the report of the personal representative, Doug Newlander from Norway, that he had appointed, he then decided to refer the matter to the court for resolution. And all of that is consistent with the Geneva Agreement, with both the governments signed. And so we are at the beginning of that process in a way, because the court having first looked at whether it had jurisdiction. That's normal where the two parties don't agree. The court, first of all, looks at the complaint. We lodged a complaint, that is Guyana, in 2018. The court had to decide whether it in fact has jurisdiction. It decided that it had jurisdiction, or it has jurisdiction, to look at the complaint, and therefore it gave a decision consistent with that, in keeping with that conclusion, namely that it had jurisdiction by virtue of things that Venezuela had signed and agreed and so forth. And so that part was over. The next thing that would normally happen is that the court would look at what they call the merits. What is the substance of the case? Never mind jurisdiction or procedural things. And in keeping with that element, Guyana submitted a memorial. That memorial set out Guyana's arguments, the issues that it felt the court should consider in deciding whether or not the 1899 award still stood or still stands and is valid, contrary to Venezuela's contention. It is that process to begin the examination of the merits, the substance of the case, that Venezuela has tried to derail or to block by lodging a preliminary objection. In normal circumstances, I suppose the layman like myself would treat it as a procedural matter. That is, you submit to the court an allegation that it's not in keeping with the rules to proceed, and therefore, in considering this preliminary objection, the court was required to suspend consideration of the substance of the matter, merits. And so that exercise, which many people would have watched November the 18th to the 22nd of 2022, they would have heard the arguments, and in those arguments, for example, was the contention by Venezuela that Guyana couldn't properly be before the court, that it should have been the United Kingdom, and so forth. A long set of arguments there, touching on a variety of things that many of us probably had never heard of before. And having listened to the arguments, read the submissions, the court then invited us to meet in The Hague again, and we met at The Hague for them to give a decision based upon the arguments they'd heard. And actually, just before that, Venezuela had tried to convince the court that it should not continue with the hearing as planned. That was rejected. And so the hearing was held. The court gave its decision, and in a very carefully crafted and very interesting decision, the court said, in essence, that the issues before it, first of all, turned on whether or not Venezuela was in a position to lodge that preliminary objection. Guyana had contended that it was time barred, and that it was also trying to overturn a decision made earlier as regards jurisdiction. Because in effect, if the court had gone ahead as Venezuela had requested, then the whole exercise would have come to a halt, and there would have been no consideration of merits. So the court said, notwithstanding the decision that it took on jurisdiction, the one party, Venezuela, was in a position to lodge a preliminary objection, and the arguments are there. I leave those for the lawyers, because whilst they are clear, they are also perhaps better left to those whose business it is to fashion that. And therefore, the court then went on to explain that whilst it accepted that the preliminary objection could be properly lodged. It didn't accept the specifics now that Venezuela was arguing, namely the need to involve the United Kingdom because it affected the UK substantively. They had things to say about the UK's behavior in 1897, 1899, and therefore the court couldn't be making decisions about the UK in the UK's absence. The court has pointed out that it had examined all of these issues, looking at precedent as well, and had concluded that the UK was aware of what was to follow in the event that there was a court case, and the UK was prepared to leave the matter to Venezuela and Guyana. And it had attempted at no point to, even in the Geneva Agreement, to insert any clauses that required its own involvement. So that, to me, that's the definitive response, and therefore the court left it for the parties to go along with the process that they had agreed in 1966. That, in essence, is where you are, and that means that the court, which had given Venezuela a deadline of last year to submit their memorial, now has to revisit the question of the Venezuelan memorial, because Venezuela, in using this instrument, didn't adhere to the deadline, and no memorial has been submitted. But the court has subsequently instructed the two parties that the new deadline is to be April 8th of 2024. By that date, Venezuela needs to submit its memorial if it wants its own arguments to be taken into account. And that is, as briefly and as succinctly as I can put the matter. What's interesting about the case is that you will remember that on the last occasion, when they were looking at the question of jurisdiction, there was a unanimous decision. In this case, the court decided with only one dissenting vote cast. There can have been few decisions that were so definitive, or few judgments that can have been so definitively supported in the past. Again, in essence, what has happened is that the court has looked at the arguments and come down on those proffered by Guyana, and that's where it stands.
Thank you, Ambassador. And if we are looking at our screen, Devin is putting up Rajendra Singh, and like many of us, we really want to offer congratulations to you and your team, as Mr. Singh said, for a job magnificently done. Now, what we need to also put in place, Mr. Greenidge, and to our viewers, is that this is not the substantive issue, as you said. This is only the objections that Venezuela had made. And this is about, what is it, second or third time that they have tried to put a roadblock and the court ruled in our favor?
Well, you may see it being said that there have been two preliminary objections. However, the court itself, in its decision, regarded them as a single preliminary objection, that there weren't two, there is one preliminary objection, and it has rejected that.
Okay.
I mean, there have been various devices to derail the process, but as regards the formality of a preliminary objection, it's one.
Okay, and I see Mr. Is that Colin Walsh saying, again, congratulations, and let's keep our focus on the issue until we get through with this case. Now, you mentioned, Ambassador, that of the 15 members of the court, 14 voted against Venezuela and one voted for Venezuela. Was the person who voted for Venezuela the judge that Venezuela had appointed or was given that opportunity to appoint?
Yes, the judge ad hoc, which Venezuela was entitled to appoint. That is because the court didn't have a Venezuelan as a standing member or a sitting member. They were entitled to name a judge ad hoc, which they did. And that judge ad hoc, as it happens, was the previous registrar of the court, and a Belgian by nationality, very experienced both at the national level and at the court where he's been for many years. And it seems that he has, he thought that the Venezuelan arguments found favor. I mean, he did agree in part with the court when as regards what is called the admissibility part. He and the court agreed, but they parted ways as regards what is the merits of the Venezuela case, whether Britain needed to be, whether Guyana was properly before the court. And he and they parted ways on that.
Okay. I know the last time we met, Ambassador, on this program, I had asked you a question, and I know you yourself is not an attorney, but discussing with your team, are they foreseeing any other roadblock that Venezuela will throw in the equation before the substantive issue is determined or is argued before the court?
Well, I'm speaking to you now in my own capacity rather than as the agent for the team. But looking around, not only with our own team, but elsewhere, asking and looking at the literature, it is at this point not anticipated that there are any easy means of derailment that are available to them. However, let me say that these are law courts in which you have practitioners of considerable experience, some men who have been at it, that's been their only business in international law, and indeed at the ICJ for years. And therefore, it would be rash, it would be very rash to say to you, the Venezuelans have exhausted all means of diverting the court. If you look at what has happened with other countries, for example, I noticed that last year, the court was dealing with the problem of Kenya and Somalia. And all sorts of strange things occurred there, where even the entire Kenyan team was replaced at one stage. And then the court was asked for more time to allow the Kenyan government to assemble another team and for them to get briefed and all that. So all sorts of things are possible. All sorts of things are possible. Whether the court, bearing all that has already occurred and the length of time that this matter has been in limbo, Guyana has been in limbo, whether it will then allow or still allow one side or the other to further delay the process is another matter. One has to trust the court and its judgment in that regard.
And before Dr. Rose comes on, you mentioned a date in 2024. What is that date for?
This is April the 8th, when the Venezuelans are required, by which date they're required to submit their memorial, if they're going to submit one. That's the deadline. That's the deadline for the submission of their memorial, which is in response to the one we submitted in 2022.
Okay. I just want to tell our Guyanese friends who are so anxious to get this over with, and I see some of the comments that, we need to get this over because of the oil. Well, we have waited, for 50 years? So we can wait a little couple more years. Let us have some patience. I know Ambassador Greenidge and his team are doing, we all know they are doing a phenomenal job. So we need to give them time, and I'm sure all of us are sure. Now, we don't know how the court will rule in the substantive issue, but we feel strongly, like Ambassador Greenidge and his team and all Guyanese, that the court will most likely rule in Guyana's favor. But we have to wait for that day to come. And
Dr. Rose, thank you, since you've mentioned several times that There have been sentiments expressed, congratulations and so forth. May I in turn say thanks to your audience for their support, which matters and will matter even more so in the future when a decision is handed down in trying to ensure that if that decision is not doesn't meet with Venezuela's favor, that it will depend upon the Guyanese all over the world to try and ensure that the government's feet are held to the fire and that they adhere to their obligations as members of the United Nations.
Very wise words there, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, Dr. Rose.
Mr. Ambassador, I don't know if you heard this, but following the ruling, there have been some chattering by Venezuela and its friends. They want to establish a bilateral commission between the two countries, Guyana and Venezuela, to iron out the problems or find a solution to it. Would Guyana agree to such a bilateral commission? And would it not be a backward step?
Well, you know that the people who try to have resort to bilaterals, whether you call it a commission or just bilateral negotiations, those who depend upon that depend upon the Geneva Agreement and the wording in the Geneva Agreement, and only part of the wording in the Geneva Agreement. Let me make this clear. As far as I understand, and we have argued that the Geneva Agreement, Article 4, points us to means of resolving this issue. And in pointing us to the means of resolving this issue, they take us to Section 33 of the United Nations Convention, which lists a number of means by which the two parties can resolve the problem. And the thing goes something like this. The Secretary General of the United Nations consults with the countries, and they go to the list and they choose one. And then that one doesn't solve the problem. They consult again and they choose one of the others. Now, there is none, as far as I'm concerned, and again, I'm speaking in a private capacity, none of the means listed in Section 33 of the Geneva Agreement finds favor with the two sides. Remembering that where the two sides go forward, under the aegis of the UN Secretary General, they have to agree. Okay? And if they don't agree, then the UN Secretary General was left to choose. And it is precisely because they couldn't agree. Let me just ask you something. In that listing, and according to some of these people who are writing and suggesting all these avenues that have either not been exploited yet or not been exploited at all or not been properly exploited, which country are you going to get to agree to an arbitration, whether it is an international arbitration or regional arbitration? The two sides agree on the outcome of the arbitration panel, the results. They implement it for 63 years. And then one partner suddenly says, look, I'm not going with that anymore. Why would you expect, or, I mean, is it not a question of perhaps a faulty judgment of human nature for you to expect the other party to say, okay, let's go again, let's have another arbitration? Having entered into some of those processes in good faith, I think any government in Guyana is going to find it very, very difficult to even let it be known that they are prepared to consider a means which the other side has abused. That is my view on the matter. So this question of whether they can be bilateral discussions is, to me, perhaps not being offered in good faith in the way that one had entered the arbitration in 1899 in good faith. In other words, the answer to the question is that is a most unlikely avenue for the government of Guyana to entertain.
Agreed. Now that the ICJ's International Court of Justice, or the World Court, has made its preliminary ruling in favor of Guyana, what is the next step? When is the next step for the substantive case? Is a date being set? And can you tell our listeners what this substantive case entails?
Well, the answer to the last question as to what it entails depends in part on what Venezuela does by way of its own memorial. Guyana has submitted a memorial. The memorial points to the history of the case, the history of the occupation of the area that we called Guyana, how it evolved from 3 colonies governed by, initially governed on paper by Spain. Subsequent to 1648, they having been handed over to the United Provinces. So there's a part of it that involves the history of the area, examining footprints of the different countries. Of course, the biggest footprint is actually the Dutch footprint, running from 1648 until 1814. And then subsequent to 1814, the British footprint, and then the amalgamation of the 3 territories. But all of that in a way, and I know my lawyer friends tend to not exercise much patience when they hear us go through all of that history. That is part of it, and I don't no doubt at some point that will be raised. But the real issue before us is of 1899 or 1897, 1899, and the International Arbitration Panel. Whatever may have happened before that, the panel looked at all the complaints. They looked at all the allegations. They looked at the maps, which were false, fake, good, not so good, because map making, even today, in a place like the Amazon, as you know, is not really an art, is not really a science. It is an art. You have countries waking up one morning and deciding that this is a river called Epoxy, and the source of that river is no longer Melville. It is another source, and therefore now they feel they can demand more territory because there was a mistake made. But that shows you that these things are not they're not set in stone. Anyhow, after 1899, what I think will have to happen is for the parties to show that something happened after 1899, which in effect means that if one is to accept a contention that the territory somehow belongs to Venezuela, what is it that happened to make the 1899 treaty invalid? What happened after 1899 to do that? I'm putting this to you. In other words, there's a spectrum of arguments that can arise. Where it actually settles and focuses will depend on what Venezuela is going to argue. We have argued the whole spectrum. We've looked at the history of settlement of the area. We've looked at the language spoken in these areas. We've looked at the place names. We've looked at the names of the settlers, the people that are to be found there. And of course, I don't have to go through it. We know that it is Dutch, Amerindian, and English names.
Right.
You're not going to find Spanish names. In the Creoles of Guyana, you will find no Spanish of any consequence, if any at all. And therefore, those are areas, if they come before the court, that we are absolutely confident in. So if Venezuela comes and argues, well, the treaty arising from the from the arbitral decision is invalid, they will have to show that there was corruption involved, that there's excessive power, there's misinterpretation, and so forth. There are specific criteria set out that guide the International Court and similar courts regarding any allegations of invalidity of an agreement of this kind. And it may turn on that alone. But as you would have seen from the initial arguments in November, the things that Venezuela chose to argue about, our own attorneys suggested were irrelevant to the consideration of whether or not the treaty was valid. So I'm simply saying to you, I can't answer that definitively because it depends on what Venezuela will say. But what I'm saying to you is that before the court right now is Guyana's memorial. And Guyana's memorial, which can be accessed on the website of the International Court of Justice, covers the full spectrum of areas that we think are relevant to Venezuela's contention. When the time comes for them to argue, they will find, maybe because of what we have said or what they may have learned, that they will have to narrow the case, their arguments, down to a single area or a couple of areas, and not that entire spectrum running from history from 1648 until 2023. It is most unlikely, of course, that modern history or anything that would have happened in most recent times would be relevant to making their case. So you probably have to go back, and I suspect it will not go far outside of the deliberations of the arbitration panel. At the same time, the question you will want to ask, is it proper for you to suddenly rerun an arbitration hearing when so much time, months, and over 6,000 pages of documents and all of that were prepared and examined, and when, with the passage of time, many of those who had first-hand experience of the issues will not be on hand to give evidence? Is that fair? So now the first part of the question you asked, how long is the next stage or phase likely to take? The answer has to be similarly vague, if you forgive me. First of all, the court has given Venezuela, in effect, an additional year to prepare their memorial, although they would have had all the time Guyana had to prepare its own memorial, plus the period between that presentation in 2022 by Guyana and now. What the court has now decided to do is to give them an additional year. And when the time comes for that submission to be considered by the court, other things could happen. It could be that they would ask for more time. It could be that in their submission, something requires some additional element of consideration. But in essence, what should happen in a normal circumstances is that goes before the court, and Guyana may choose to respond or not to respond by saying, look, we've already addressed all those arguments they've raised, and therefore we don't have anything to add. The point I'm making here is significant in the sense that depending on whether you choose to send or argue additional material, that will add to the time required, because the court will then have to receive your documents and it may want to ask you questions on it. And Venezuela may then ask for the opportunity to respond to those responses. So depending on what happens there, the time before us can be stretched. I can't say with any authority what that would mean time-wise, but I would be surprised if that could take more than 2 years. I'd be surprised.
Okay, here's the bombshell question, Mr. Ambassador. This decision was handed down on the 6th of April. Today is the 12th. Venezuela has not responded. Their response is that they're looking at the results, but they think that the ICJ did not take their full argument into consideration before making this decision. Now, my question to you is, this is what's coming from the Venezuela on the international scene. My question to you is this. What happens if Maduro's refused to accept the decision that was handed down there and refuses to participate in any further court proceedings? Will the ICJ continue the case in its absence?
The chairman of the ICJ responded to that possible eventuality or that possibility when pronouncing on jurisdiction and made it very clear that Venezuela has a right to participate or to not participate. Whether or not it participates beyond today, as I understand it, is immaterial. If it chooses not to participate, the court will continue with its business and give a judgment based upon whatever documentation they have before them, which will include, of course, the arguments contained in Guyana's memorial. And he made it clear also that Venezuela, as a member of the UN, and given the way, the means by which it arrived as a party to this case, it will be bound by the decision of the court. And now that it has joined the court in the sense that they named a judge ad hoc, they named an agent and co-agents, it is difficult to see how they can argue that they will not be bound by what the court says. That's the situation as it stands now.
Okay, I agree with that. Now, if Venezuela does not participate and does not accept the court decision, you know the ICJ cannot enforce any laws by itself. So this means that what the future holds for Guyana, this border dispute will continue.
Well, that is why when I was asked by Mr. Sugrim, when he spoke about the Guyanese who have been looking, following the program and following the case, that's why I made reference to the importance of those people. If you look at what has been happening across the globe, it is true that since the court has been in existence, many countries have refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction. But my reading of the situation is this, that over the years, and especially in recent years, you will find that because the membership of the court has economic and political muscle, it becomes increasingly uncomfortable for people to infringe international law and then to argue that they are the sole arbiters and whatever the court says, they don't have to accept. So I can just, again, off the top of my head, remind you of the case between Cameroon and Nigeria. I mentioned that one because Nigeria had all along contended that it would not and it would never accept the decision of the court. And then when the court made the decision and it appeared to be even more unfavorable, they, as men now say, doubled down and insisted. But my understanding is that as of now, Nigeria has accepted the decision of the court, as have many others who started off by saying they wouldn't. Now, the question of whether you are held in limbo forever will depend on how effective you are in using the diplomatic arena, in using the political arena. Not so much the legal one, because you've exhausted the legal one by going to the court, but there are still possibilities there. Eventually, you can, of course, go to the General Assembly if if a country ignores the decision of the court and then seeks to have its own way by use of force or by any other mechanism. But assuming that that is out, the work that is before us is to ensure that we build and utilize strong enough diplomatic services which enable us to work along with allies, to keep them abreast of what is going on, and to have them assist us in the various fora and press Venezuela to live by international law and its own obligations, if that becomes a problem.
Okay. The question is, you know as well as I do, that the United States is a major violator of the International Court of Justice. It did it with a case, I think, against Bolivia and another case in Peru, and it withdrew from a case in one that I think was in Europe or something of the sort. So United States cannot tell Venezuela you have to accept the laws, because Venezuela said, well, you refused to accept the ICJ ruling on 3 occasions. But my question to you is this. If Venezuela refuses to accept it, you talk about your allies, is it possible that Guyana can turn to its Latin American neighbors to pressure Venezuela to cease and desist from this border dispute and to move on? Is Guyana prepared to do that?
Well, you'll notice that I have not mentioned the United States. Guyana has a peculiarity
Why you have not mentioned the United States?
Hmm?
Why?
Well, Guyana is a very peculiar place, maybe because of the number of Guyanese who have migrated to the US and around, and because of the strength of US propaganda in Guyana. Guyana believes that it has, or a lot of people believe Guyana has no problems internationally. All it has to do is to convince the US to come to its assistance. But as you know, the US, whether it is the world's #1 power, it's the world's #2 power, has its own national interests to look after.
Right.
And that is why I was very clear when I said to you, or intended to be very clear, that it is a diplomatic capacity and a political capacity that you have to burnish and to develop. You can't depend upon one state alone to assist and to protect you. And we recognized this a long time ago. That is one of the reasons why there has been, notwithstanding difficulties that may arise in CARICOM or in CARIFORUM or in the CELAC countries, for example, or in the fragments of the non-aligned movement, if I might put it that way, or with our allies in Africa, South Asia, and elsewhere. You have to constantly work with those allies. You can't just say, well, don't worry with them, they have political power. They have political power, they have diplomatic power, they exercise influence. Sometimes you don't even realize when they exercise economic influence. And so whatever the US does, we still have to do our work. And that's a point I like to keep hammering. I'm afraid that we have responsibilities. And if we don't recognize that one of our responsibilities is to maintain alliances across the world, whether it is the ACP, whether it is CARICOM, if you don't do that, you've got nowhere to go. Even to the extent, as I was saying, to some rather ambitious representatives of the private sector. You can't wake up a morning and decide that you are going to cost down the partners in a trade agreement because something has happened that you're not pleased with, and then say that it has no consequences. We can break laws and break treaties and it has no consequence. That is nonsense. You have obligations. And not only do you have obligations, but if you are to get support for your rights as a tiny member of the international community, one without muscle, even with petroleum, one without muscle, then you have to make sure that you build and maintain, or as the cognoscenti would say, you have to keep your diplomatic links in good repair.
Okay. Is Ghana using its diplomatic links with Latin America, the CELA countries? I know it's doing it with CARICOM, but do you think that the Middle Eastern countries, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, those countries have major influence because they're all from the same oil cartel? Is the United States, is Ghana using those type of diplomatic channels to help bolster its case against Venezuela? I know Venezuela is doing it. Venezuela is all over the Middle Eastern countries.
Well, I'm glad you make that point because I think at times we forget that. In fact, certainly whilst I was minister with responsibility for these things, we never missed an opportunity to work with our allies, whether it is Saudi Arabia, whether it is Kuwait, to emphasize the importance of this issue to Guyana, the injustice that we face as a small country being bullied by a larger one. And you will find that some of the strongest statements in support of Guyana come from those partners far outside the Atlantic waters that wash our shores. A lot of them have been strongly in support of us, and they, at the appropriate time, if you crank them properly, will stand up in defense or speak in the corridors of power to Venezuela and its friends concerning their unhappiness with what is happening.
Quickly though, is Ghana doing this secretly? Because what I'm seeing is that Maduro is all over the Middle Eastern countries whipping up support, but I haven't seen Ghana doing that.
Well,
is it being done secretly?
I don't think it can be helpful to do it secretly. The administration is aware of the need to do it even aggressively. It is aware of the significance of exercising soft power in that context, collaborating with these countries where you have cultural links, where you haven't, but you can build cultural links or other links.
Is Ghana doing it though? That's my question to you.
Well, it is doing it. Whether it can do it more intensively, I have no doubt. It can.
Okay. Charles?
Ambassador, to pick up on that question, you mentioned when you had direct responsibility for it, you were using that soft power, as you said, to lobby our friends and, and those who see our cause and try to be on our side. Is there evidence that currently we have put a little damper to that, or have we accelerated it? Have we muted it? What is going on in your view? I know you're not directly involved with the administration in terms of that aspect of it, but in your view, talking to your friends across the globe, because you still have friends in different governments of the world, is Guyana pursuing that part that you have said that you have done when you're in charge?
Just before you answer that, Mr. Greenidge, let me just tell the audience this, because they do ask us these questions. We're using terminologies and we don't explain it. Soft power means non-political power, like economic power and so forth. That's what soft power is, audience. So they don't have to ask us this question again. Go ahead, Mr. Greenidge.
Yes, thanks ever so much. Yeah. Of course, in this part of the world, one of the countries with the greatest exercise of soft power is Jamaica, that our people will know the influence of that Jamaica can exercise by virtue of its athletic prowess, the impact of its musical ambassadors or its ambassadors of culture. All these things give you an opportunity to reach into the corridors of power in all sorts of countries, or for your pleas or your arguments to be received sympathetically. Obviously, there's a lot more for Ghana to do in that regard. We don't really excel in the way that a Brazil or Jamaica does in that regard today. The government is aware, because very earlier on we had discussed this, and the administration assigned responsibilities to institutions and persons to pursue this. Now, if you look at somebody else carrying out a task, it is always going to appear that you could have done it better. You would put the emphasis somewhere differently from where they put the emphasis, and all of that continues. So I don't really want to make a judgment in that regard. I'm simply saying to you that they know, the administration knows what needs to be done. There's always going to be disagreement as to whether enough is being done. And however much they're doing, a lot more needs to be done. That goes without saying. And perhaps it ought to be easier for us now that we have resources at our disposal, which we didn't have, say, a year or two ago. So that it is a constant, you know, I think what sometimes is forgotten is that dimension of the diplomatic and political and cultural initiative has to be an ongoing routine. It isn't that we did it last year and we're going to do it again in 5 years' time. You do it yesterday and you must do it later today too. That's what has to happen.
When you were the foreign minister, ambassador, and I'm glad you mentioned the power of the sports from Jamaica and the power of the music and so on. Did we reach out? I know we had Sir Clive Lloyd on this program, and he did say that the president was in contact with him, but we didn't ask him the details of that. That's a personal between he and the president. But have you reached out to our sportsmen, you know, those who had so much goodwill around the world? You know, we had Clive Lloyd, we have Ron Kanai, Khalid Sharan, you know, great. Currently now, you know, we still have some. Plus, you know, we're doing well in badminton and just some other sports, some sports area. Are we using the full benefit of what that element can help us in seeking more support and more friends in the international community?
Well, rather than respond to that as a question, I would say to you that I hope that those who can answer that question will have heard you and will see what they can do to intensify their efforts in that regard. Surely we don't feature as prominently as a Jamaican, but we do have lots of people, sometimes even Guyanese, unrecognized and unacknowledged, who we can actually utilize to help us in this exercise. And more of that needs to be done. We have outside of cricket, and I don't want you to be giving badminton priority over squash. We have done remarkably well in squash over the years, and I would hope that you would remember that. But no, I'm serious.
You're right.
A lot to be done in that regard.
Okay, Ambassador, you keep mentioning memorial that we submitted to the World Court. Is that the briefing? What is memorial in the legal jargon?
When Guyana made its reacting to the SG's decision, okay, reacting to the SG's decision in 2018, Guyana submitted to the court a dossier, which dossier contains a series of arguments with supporting documents as to why the 1899 award is still valid and why the borders as defined by that award, and it is the only document that defines our borders. We are involved in a case before the court, but you know, international law requires that if a border is to be changed, it is to be changed to a border. You can't abandon a border on grounds that you don't like it and there is nothing in its place. The document that defines Guyana's border is that 1899 award plus the boundaries that Venezuela signed in 1905 and the boundaries that Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil signed later on in the 1920s, 1927, 28. These define our borders. And some of them, just as a matter of interest, are reflected in documents signed by more than one country, which poses a difficulty for Venezuela. You asking Guyana to speak to you about a border when the signatories to some of those borders are 3 countries: Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, Guyana, and Venezuela, for example. Why would you just choose 2 of them to change the border? What happens to the other country, especially if that country has in the past given up claims so as to ensure that there could be a peaceful resolution of that set of borders? This is true of Brazil. Brazil has no border disputes with anyone, but it had laid claim to significant tracts in the south of Guyana, which areas included places such as Lethem around the Rupununi. So if you take Venezuela seriously and you attempt to speak to them, and since their own view of what is acceptable requires the transfer of land. I mean, this isn't what the Geneva Agreement says, actually, but that is how they speak to the world, and that is how you will see the submission to the court is cast. Then what is it you say to the other countries which were party to those boundaries? So it isn't as simple a case as Venezuela is trying to make out. All you have to do is to sit down with them in a few minutes and agree something bilaterally, which actually affects more than 2 countries.
You mentioned, Ambassador, that the demarcation of the boundaries prior to 1899, if I hear you correctly, was done by the British. Is that correct?
The boundaries were really not clearly demarcated before 1899. What I said was that in 1899, you had international boundaries. In 1905, the international boundary with Venezuela was demarcated with the assistance of Venezuelan technicians, as well as the Guyanese. Prior to that, it would depend on what period you're speaking about. In the 1840s and the 1850s, the government had worked with Schomburg and others to identify the areas settled and who was settling those areas, whether they were traditional indigenous people, whether they were also Spanish speakers or what have you. But those borders were not defined in the way that we know them to be defined now. And that was part of the challenge. And that is why I said to you that for the lawyers and for a lot of people, the point at which you start would be 1899, when the 2 sides agreed, 2 sides and Britain agreed. From henceforth, these are the boundaries. This is the boundary line.
Mr. Prashad has been asking a question. Is the Ankoko part of that boundary settlement? Who owns the Ankoko after the boundaries were established?
After 1899, as a result of the 1899 decision, the line ran through Ankoko. The boundary ran through Ankoko. It still runs through Ankoko. Ankoko is illegally occupied by Venezuelans at this point in time.
So it's like the Quarantine River or something to that effect?
No, that's different. In the case of Ankoko, the international treaty specifically identifies Ankoko and says where the line runs. In the case of Ankoko, notwithstanding that, or because of that, Venezuela has itself, using its military power, occupied it and refused to move. And this is mentioned in the submission to the court.
And I'm glad, Ambassador, you mentioned the military power. And I don't know if you're privy to this, or maybe you're also in the prior administration. Are we preparing Guyanese for the what if possibility. What if Venezuela, after the ruling, they decided, you know what, we will invade and take over that part? Are we training our people to defend Guyana? We know we go to the rum shop and we are like tiger, we are ready to kill the tiger. And when we get sober the next day, you know, you know what I'm talking about. Are we training our young people for that eventuality? Hey guys, you want to defend your country? We got to start training you now for it.
Well, you know, defending your country is a complicated exercise, and it also depends very much on building a confidence in your people about not only about your rights, but your ability notwithstanding your size. The greatest example we've seen in recent times has been, of course, Ukraine, where a very, very small state, a very small population, well, a small population has done all sorts of magic in the face of a massive and militarily heavily armed neighbor. There have been many other instances, even in that part of Europe, one is thinking of Finland and so forth. But a government has to work with its populace. And one of the things that I think we have to recognize is that you have really to ensure that policies and actions convince your public that what is being done is in all their interest. And that is a challenge that we're still working on. That's clear.
Also, we can think
a question of putting arms in people's cars or putting arms in their house.
No, I'm not, Ambassador. I'm not saying that. I'm saying.
I know.
I'm saying. Yeah, I'm saying like in here in the U.S., as you know, there is the you can go to the reserve and you're actually trained for that purpose. You don't have to get a military, firearm in your car, but at least you're trained. It's not that we wake up one morning, Venezuela invades us, and then we're running like helter-skelter. We have 6,000 military, to defend our country. I think of 600,000 of us ready to take on that challenge, even though we're like a rat in front of a tiger. We still have power together. And of course, the world, as you rightly said, as we look at Russia and Ukraine, that's a classical example. The Ukrainians have been ever so willing to defend their territory. And I'm not sure we Guyanese are ready for that yet if we are called upon to do it. And I'm saying for us to do that, at least we need some training.
Sure, and I believe there are in place arrangements. At what level of readiness I can't say, but there are militia type, if you like, arrangements whereby people who are not soldiers are trained. And the thing that Ukraine shows us also is not only the need to teach persons to fire weapons, but also to utilize their skills, whether it is as architects, as engineers, as software operators, as normal members of the public who can observe and utilize the modern communication and information revolution to ensure that information is channeled, received and processed in circumstances that are quite amazing. And we've seen that where civilians were able to identify for the Ukrainian military movements, and a military that didn't have a capacity to have people in every place was able to get information about equipment, about supplies, logistics, and so forth taking place in their site. And they were able to transmit that information to where it matters. So a lot of training is required in areas that we would not normally be paying much attention to. And so that is very important. We have to learn that this is 2023. not 1823. So, new technologies, new approaches need to be developed.
Without doubt. Mr. Ambassador, do you think this might be a great issue to bring the government and the opposition together on one footing to encourage all Guyanese to at least let us start that process of training, whatever that training is?
Well, I think it would be appropriate, let me put it this way, whether you can persuade the parties in question to sit down and see that as in the national interest and beyond party interest is another matter. But those things I don't want to say too much. Let people interpret it in a manner convenient to themselves and not as I intended. But it is an important part of defense.
I listen to you carefully, but I will now ask President Ali and opposition leader, Mr. Norton, please get together for this issue and call our people together. Let us be prepared. Let us start this process. We got a plan in the eventuality. If the court rules in our favor and Venezuela refuses to accept that and they want to do whatever they're threatening us to do, our people are prepared. But we cannot wait until tomorrow to give them a cutlass to go and fight a battle. We have to give them the training necessary. And Mr. Norton, as opposition leader, President Ali as our president, please on this issue, work together for the good of our country. Dr. Rose?
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Greenidge, there's been a talking or an argument or a discussion that the United States will not allow Venezuela to do anything inappropriate against Guyana because they have ExxonMobil there, the American oil giant or colossal, giant and so forth. And in that sense, oil is the key that will keep Americans occupied against Venezuela. But that argument is weak because Americans have 5 times more investment in Venezuela in oil than in Guyana. So that argument cannot hold up. Why will the United States attack Venezuela and destroy Venezuela when it depends on Venezuelan oil, which is far greater than our oil, to protect Guyana? Can you answer that?
Well, you've thrown up a straw man because I would never, and I have never encouraged Guyanese to believe that the United States owes them anything in that regard. You have to show you're capable of recognizing your own interests, you're capable of fighting for your own interests, and that is when you will get allies. And that's why I emphasize there is a diplomatic dimension, an international dimension, regional, political, international, diplomatic dimension. You have to do that work all the time. And in addition, you have to show those who you want to help you that you can mobilize your people, that you can work with your people. It's not going to be a case where a neighbor, whether it is United States or somebody else closer, will wake up a morning and say, oh my goodness, somebody's threatening Guyana. Let's go to Guyana's rescue. And the Guyanese are either giving up or fleeing. Nobody's going to bother to come to your rescue. So yes, the US has its own interest. That's why I say the bigger the country is, the more its national interest will take priority over those of its allies. And yes, the two interests may coincide. It is partly a diplomatic task to make sure that they recognize that those interests coincide. If you don't do enough on the diplomatic front, on the political front, and on the economic front, that will not happen. But that alone isn't sufficient. You have to ensure that you're seen as a reliable ally. You've mobilized your people know what they're doing, they're strong, they're committed, and so forth. That is what we've learned in recent years.
As someone who teaches foreign policy and diplomacy and international relations and so forth, I'm yet to learn what is the U.S. Guyana's policy vis-a-vis Venezuela outside of the international court case. I've more anything being said. I don't know how much focus being given to this issue. I mean, you're there, you're there because of the court case. But outside of the court case, what other focus or what other policies the government is putting in place and let the nation knows about what's going on with Venezuela? I've more than anything about it.
Well, I think in fairness to the administrations, current and past, building relationships with Venezuela has to be difficult because of the extent of the Venezuelan claim and the extent to which Venezuela makes this a precondition for anything else. There are many areas on which we can collaborate. There are health issues, the question of whether it is of malaria, dengue, AIDS, all sorts of things. And it's worse now that you have so many Venezuelans flooding Guyana, that on the health front, a great deal needs to be done and should be done. There are areas that we can collaborate on, even in the development, whether it is of watersheds and so forth. But usually, if you want to collaborate on health, for example, and you're looking at malaria in the border areas, there are going to be times, and there have been times in the past, where you say, look, our regional health authority is located in such a way that we can assist on both sides of the border. So let us agree that in this area where there are health challenges, we will cover geographical space, some of which is yours. And you, further to the north, can cover geographical space, which includes an area that is part of Guyana's sovereign territory. And we can collaborate in that way for purposes of attacking some specific challenges. That has been done in the past, but it has not been sustainable, primarily because we have a difficulty with that neighbor that believes that they don't, it's not in their interest.
But
so it can be a problem.
Is Ghana building up any rapport with its neighboring Latin American countries?
Yes, they have been. In the context of CELAC, in the context of UNISO and others, there have been quite a lot of discussions, but it isn't a Guyana-Venezuela problem alone that, The problem between Venezuela and the rest of the region, the problem between Venezuela, Bolivia, and depend on who else is in there, Argentina and the rest of the region, has meant that initiatives that are regional or sub-regional initiatives that the countries have embraced have not been sustained. As soon as the rhetoric gets too hot, these initiatives have been abandoned. UNISOR is one of them, for example. The question of road infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, all of those were part and parcel of discussions that Guyana was part of. And it remains to be seen whether with the changes of government, one will be in a position to take up the loose ends again.
The question is this, though. CELA suspended Venezuela. Maduro seems not to care about anything. The United States imposed all sort of sanctions, and he survived them just like Cuba. So Venezuela is a rogue country. Maduro is a radical. So my question is, the government of Guyana has to prepare itself and come up with policies and strategies outside of Venezuela to strengthen its relationship with other countries in order to pressure Venezuela to abandon its claim.
Yes.
The government is doing that. They've been doing that.
Well, I think so, yes. This I think everybody recognizes. You can't do it on your own. And most certainly, quite a lot has been done. I mean, without attempting to be, to appear to be completely balanced, let me say that quite a bit has been done in relation to Ghana-Latin American cooperation in the pre-2015 period and subsequently. A lot was done in the pre-2015 period, even with Venezuela. And as you saw what happened with the if you might call it the oil for rice deal.
Right.
That underlying all that were other issues that Venezuela didn't really make explicit. But we continue to work, and even when we couldn't do more with Venezuela, you see a lot done in the collaboration with the OAS, collaboration with CELAC, and in the UNISOR arena. I think the will is there. We don't often have the resources to match obligations because we are tiny. When you have movements in this region, in Latin America or in South America region, and they start to put together meetings even for engineering purposes, you don't even have the money to send the engineers to 10% of the meetings because it's a lot of space you're dealing with and a lot of collaboration is required. And we must remember this. So to the extent that we are financially in a better position now, we should take advantage of that opportunity. But one of the problems you had in the past was that you really could not attend. Even in CARICOM, CARICOM itself finds itself challenged when invited to participate in the Latin America and Caribbean meetings because the cost of sending the few technicians they have is burdensome relative to those who are available.
Venezuela's closest ally is Cuba. Guyana is also a close ally of Cuba, a friend of Cuba. Has Guyana even extend or ask the Cubans to try to negotiate with Venezuela to stop this border dispute? What I'm saying to you is this: if you look at countries that don't have the wherewithal to fight a major country, they build allies left, right, and center against that country so that that country will eventually back. And it happens with right there with Brazil. So I'm saying we have established diplomatic relations with Cuba. Has Cuba been trying to get involved to settle this dispute? Has Guyana asked Cuba to help them settle this dispute?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't think that I don't think you should underrate the contribution of Cuba to trying to keep the peace between us. Don't underrate it. Cuba has assisted tremendously in the past. And if you look at the literature, you'll see some Venezuelans even cussing Cuba for that. As regards neighbors, there are all sorts of people with whom we have to collaborate. You have Colombia, Chile, Brazil. All of these can exercise an influence. All of them have strong diplomatic and political links with Venezuela. And yes, we have to build links with them so that they can be a common space discussing the topics of concern to all of us. I have, for example, in this bilateral discussions with the Cubans at the highest level, been party to discussions or seen the heads of state engaged in tackling or asking for clarification as to the difficulties and asking how they might help. That has happened in relation to a whole host of countries in the region, not only Cuba.
I disagree with you when you said that the ICJ has economic power and social power. To me,
no, I didn't say the ICJ has political and social power.
Not political, economic.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
The International Court has one function, and that is to resolve interstate difficulties between states.
Right.
And this is essentially in the legal sphere.
Right.
I'm saying to you that many countries start off by saying that they're not going to abide by any decision taken by the ICJ for whatever reason. And I chose Nigeria, Cameroon as an example. But then said by the time 20 or 30 years pass, you see many of them change their positions. And that is because the members of the UN, the members of the UN, who are also members of the court, can exercise influence on various parties in a variety of ways, in the same way that you were citing Cuba and the others. So that is it. Not that the ICJ exercises.
I hope we have the people at the UN can exercise this, try to convince these countries. But the thing is this, the ICJ, as most of the people don't know, is like a tiger without a teeth. It can make a ruling and no country don't have to abide because you can't put a country in jail. So I say that to tell you this. Why would Venezuela abide by any decision made by the ICJ? And this means the border dispute will drag on indefinitely because they will lay their claim the same way. They will not back down.
If you have a problem with a neighbor who is claiming your property, and you say to the rest of the village, this is my property, and your neighbor says, this is my property, none of you has any third party acceptable in the eyes of the community for making an independent judgment. You got no place to go. It depends upon force and who you can go and influence. The point of the ICJ is that if you didn't go to the ICJ, the Venezuelans will continue to behave disagreeably. But they are telling the rest of the world that theirs is a defensible case. Now, when the ICJ pronounces on the matter, they can no longer do that. And those members of the international community that have pledged themselves to live by the rule of law will see who is, many of them don't want to sit down and go through the arguments themselves. They're not interested. But they will opt to stick with the party that has justice on its side, that has the right on its side. And that is the value of going to the court. You are stronger with the court than without the court.
I agree with that. I agree with that. But let me say this. If the next week or so Venezuela comes out and say, I am not accepting the decision by the court, what happens?
Nothing happens. Nothing happens. The court will go along with its work and they will make a decision. If Venezuela is unwise enough not to argue its case in the court, then the chances of the court making a decision in favor of Venezuela are going to be that much smaller.
But Venezuela is a rogue country. Venezuela is a rogue country. It doesn't care. That's my point to you.
It does. What I'm saying to you is that you, as a tiny state, are better off with the wheels of international justice on your side than without.
Agreed.
That's the least you can do. You can't say to your people, look, we're not going to go to the court because even if we win, nothing will happen. When you win, you have to go and do more work. And that's the point I'm making.
I agree with you on that. Yeah. But we're dealing with a rogue country. Charles, over to you.
But that is always, if you're dealing with a rogue country, that's always the case. But what are you going to do? Cry? You can't go. I see Guyanese sometimes are really some great comedians. I see some set of people writing to President Biden, telling him to do this and that in relation to an American company because it's making too much money vis-a-vis Guyana. Is this a sensible and realistic approach? You have a capacity to do things on your own behalf. And that's what you have to do. Do as many of them as possible. In the court, in the commercial courts, in the regional bodies, in the international bodies, in the UN, all those things you have to do.
That's where I would encourage Guyana to go build up a good rapport with countries and international and regional bodies in order to strengthen its case even more.
Yeah. That's the least you can do.
Yeah, Charles.
It's a must.
Mr. Ambassador, we're running out of time now. But you mentioned hopefully in 2 years, this matter with the World Court, the ICJ, should be over. So you're saying by the end of 2025, around that area, we should have a definitive ruling of the court, in your view?
That is my hope, and my greater hope is that it'll finish even before then.
Earlier, okay. All right. Well, we are with you there, Mr. Ambassador, and your team. Will there be any addition to the team that is currently the legal team? Are there anyone who you're taking out of the team? You're adding any person to the team?
Well, the team in this phase ahead of us will depend upon the emphasis of Venezuela's arguments. So you will, for example, if it turns on, and it is unlikely, let us say it turns on maritime issues, it suddenly becomes a maritime issue, then of course you have to bring in experts on that side.
I got you.
But
Okay.
if it turns, for example, if it turns out that they are only going to be focusing on what happened prior to 1890, for example, or what happened in the 1850s and 1860s, it's a different set of people. You're looking now to a set of historians, those who would be expert in the history, British history at that time, Dutch historians, or those who are familiar with those areas. So this is something that the team includes historians, it includes diplomats, because these are the areas, and it includes those with a political background who might have worked in the ministry. And then you have some with all the experience, such as Sridhar Ramphal. On the diplomatic side, on the political side, he's a lawyer.
The
and
legal side.
Professional, yeah, in that regard.
And of course, once the land issue is settled, or the demarcation, the maritime boundary fall into national law. So that should hopefully follow in place.
It ought to, yes.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, we're running out of time. We want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
No, I just thank you for the opportunity, because I do feel it's important that we air these issues so that our people understand. I was saying to someone who asked me this evening about the objective of this type of session you're holding, I suppose pointing to the fact that I'm not a lawyer and this is a complicated area and so forth. The point is that people need to be assured that the issues are being examined, that the questions that they have in mind have been thought of, and if they haven't been thought of, they will now be thought of. And people need that sort of assurance. In Guyana, too often, we do not discuss things, either because we don't believe they're important, or because we really don't have time. We're busy with too many things. I think this is important enough to justify spending some time every so often. I think this is about the 5th or 6th session we've done on the border since the process began in 2017. But prior to that, of course, there were other discussions, and they were the subject of all sorts of things, booklets and so forth. This time, when you're dealing with complicated court things, it is, I think, valuable to have an opportunity to exchange ideas in this way. So thanks very much. And
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And I hear your concern too about the lackadaisical attitude of our people. That's what we are, and we hope that we can change that attitude for the benefit of our country. Dr. Rose, anything in closing, quickly?
Yeah, well, Mr. Ambassador, it came to Globespan, which is fair and balanced. We treat every issue fairly and balance everything out. We don't escape anything at all. We are not for either side. We just discuss the issues and let the points get out there to the people. Yes, I want to talk about the retirement age again, which is every week I'm going to do. It should be increased to 62 years old. Some people tell me that if we increase that, young people will not be able to get jobs. No, you got to be creative and create jobs for young people. Salary should be increased to at least $150,000 a month for our public servants, civil servants. Charles, you said 200,000, but I'm not going to touch that. And on our internet, you can't call anybody without getting interrupted. Why is Digicel and GTT not doing the good job with the internet? They need to put up more stations. Our internet is failing. This afternoon, 2 or 3 people call me, disconnect. You can't even discuss 5 minutes with somebody and it's gone. Even to get 5G or 10, whatever Gs they have.
Well, listen, let me give you the assurance that I'm happy to embrace you on some of those initiatives, even figuratively, although I suspect that if you stick too rigidly with the retirement age, the next thing I'm going to hear is that I'm the wrong side of 55. We do have a ridiculous retirement age, and I was part of a team that spoke to the government on this in 2012, pointing that out, but they threw all the blame in the lap of the trade unions and the workers who raised some of the same problems you raised. So I'll only respond to that, saying to you that a retirement age of 55 is globally unusual, and to put it less kindly, quite ridiculous when you are short of skills in the way that we're short of.
Exactly, and I don't understand how governments passed and president not seeing this.
Politics.
Person 55, you let the person go, the person just ship out, come to the States and start working again. And you lose person with all the experience and all the skills. And I also want to say this. I support President Ali. I support what he's doing. He's trying to move the country forward. But I was told, and I'm from Barbados, that for the past month.
Is that a good thing?
Pardon me?
Is that a good thing? You didn't say whether that was a good or bad thing. You said you were from Barbados, so what?
I'm going to tell you
aren't
this.
we all from Barbados?
Yeah, I know you're from Barbados.
That matter are from Barbados.
It's a good thing, but I said it to say this. I was told for the past month, we talk about development. We talk about everything, which is good. But for the past month, I was told Skeleton Hospital don't have a doctor.
Oh.
How can the Ministry of Health or the regional health officer don't know about this? You have a hospital, you don't have a doctor, and they're going to tell you also, Portland Hospital, they said they got 2 doctors, but after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they're gone. So you go there 7 o'clock at night, you can't see a doctor either. I'm from the quarantine, and I know this because I communicate with people there. How can this happen in a country that we want to move forward? Those are so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Greenidge, and we hope we can see you again as we get some additional good news about Guyana's situation with Venezuela. To our audience, we want to thank you. Thank you, Nohar, and to Devin. Until the next time, be safe, and God bless our great country of Guyana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity, and enjoy the rest of the evening.